So when it comes to the GAA, it's fair to say we all love a good comeback. Whether it was Mayo versus Dublin in 2006, whether it was Offaly versus Kerry in 1982, whether it was Westmeath versus Wexford in 2023, or whether it was Cork against Dublin in the 2014 Ladies Football Championship, there has been some amount of comebacks down the years. Late dramas, late moments, so many moments of brilliance and moments of ecstasy of the team that's completed the comeback, but of course absolute heartbreak if you're on the receiving end. And look, down the years in the GAA we have seen some extraordinary moments, and there is nothing quite like an amazing comeback. There's nothing quite like when you're sitting there on the couch watching a match, or maybe you're sitting there in the stands and you look up at the big screen and you see that your team is 10-12 points down. All of a sudden one team comes roaring back from the dead, and I think we all love stories like that. We all love stories where people are written off and they come back and prove us wrong. We love an underdog, and I think in this country in particular we just love that type of thing, don't we? We just love it. We love teams coming back from the dead. Don't get me wrong, if you're a supporter of the team who's on a receiving end of a comeback, you certainly don't love it. But I think generally speaking, we love seeing these happen. And so that's very much the topic of this video. We're going to be looking at the top 10 GAA comebacks in the history of Gaelic games. We're going to be looking at some big comebacks in ladies football, hurling, absolutely everything. We're going to be ranking them all in order from 10 to 1. We will have honourable mentions as well. And do bear in mind when it comes to these comebacks, like I think there's some comebacks that might be better than others in terms of like it might have been a bigger comeback by distance, but I think for me, for comebacks that happen in All-Ireland finals, semi-finals, provincial finals, for me they mean more than games that happen in the early rounds of the Leinster Championship or the early rounds of different championships, in my opinion. I think for teams who complete comebacks in the big moments, in big finals, when the pressure is well and truly on, they for me is why some of those comebacks are higher than some others on this list. But let me know in the comments down below, what do you think the best GAA comeback has ever been in the history of Gaelic games? And anyway, let's get into it, starting with number 10. So in at number 10, it's probably a comeback that's very fresh in the memory, and that's Westmeath versus Wexford in the Leinster Senior Hurling Championship round robin match day number 4. Now you will remember this, it happened pretty much only a couple of months ago, and obviously it's a very recent comeback that happened. It's very fresh in the memory. It actually is statistically the greatest comeback of all time in the history of the GAA. Westmeath trailed by 17 points at the start of the second half and managed to come back and win the game. Now you might be looking at it and thinking, Westmeath, their first championship win over Wexford since 1940, and obviously it's the biggest comeback statistically of all time. So you might be looking at it and thinking, why is this not higher on the list? Well, the main reason why it's not higher on the list is because of the fact that it was done in a Leinster round robin game as opposed to a big championship game like a provincial final or an All-Ireland final. And ultimately Westmeath actually still went on to get relegated, losing to Antrim the following week, and Wexford beat Kilkenny and stayed up and avoided relegation. But that's not to take away from it. I mean, look, there's been plenty of comebacks down the years, and this did make it number 10 on the list. And to be fair, like most people, including myself, remember looking at the scoreline and Score Bio, would have completely switched off from this game at half time. It looked an absolute formality. Wexford were cruising to victory. They were looking like they were going to, be nailed on to potentially get out of the Leinster Championship and set up a grandstand finish between them and Kilkenny. And obviously it was 17 points going into the start of the second half, but a flurry of late goals from substitute Niall Mitchell and 2 goals and 3 points from Niall O'Brien completed one of the most remarkable comebacks in GAA history. It was Westmeath's first win over Wexford since 1940, and I think, look, ultimately Westmeath still went on to get relegated and they will play in the Joe McDonagh Cup next season, which is why it's not higher on this list as opposed to some other comebacks. But I think at the same time it's a result and it's a day that will live long in the memory of Westmeath fans, and you won't be taking this away from Westmeath fans anytime soon. And as for Wexford, this was certainly one of their worst results in the history of Wexford GAA. I mean, don't get me wrong, Westmeath, you give them credit for turning it around, but to throw away a 17-point lead, it doesn't look good from a Wexford point of view. At number 9, we have Galway versus Kilkenny in 2014. For large parts, this looked like another routine Kilkenny victory over Galway. A young TJ Reid scored a goal and 8 points, whilst Owen Larkin scored a goal and a point. Henry Shefflin also featured, scoring a point for the Cats, as it looked like a fairly routine and comfortable victory for Kilkenny. The Tribesmen trailed by 10 points with 9 minutes remaining, and this looked an absolute formality. Kilkenny looked like they were going to book themselves another big win over Galway. Galway had other ideas. They came roaring back, a couple of late points. Conor Cooney played a top-class performance. He scored 2-7 in total and played some wonderful moments in the closing stages to turn this game around. Joe Canning scored 2 absolute wonder points in the end to force a replay. An extraordinary turnaround from Galway, a game that looked like it was dead and buried from a Kilkenny perspective, and we're so used to seeing Kilkenny coming back from the dead, but this time around it was Galway who proved that they are a top team, an extraordinary comeback, and they ended up forcing a replay, having been 10 points down with 9 minutes remaining. Not bad at all. Kilkenny did win the replay, however, so that will, ultimately look back, and Galway will be disappointed with that, to be fair. But at the same time, an extraordinary turnaround from a Galway perspective. In at number 8, it's Limerick versus Tipperary in the 2021 Munster Senior Hurling Championship Final. And this again is a result and a performance that probably does live long in the memory from Limerick supporters, and certainly not if you are a Tipperary supporter. And it is quite fresh in the memory as well. It was only 2 seasons ago. Limerick oversaw a 10-point deficit at half-time to produce one of the best second-half performances we have ever seen in the Munster Championship. Goals from John O'Dwyer and Jake Morris set Tipperary on their way as they led 2-16 to 12 points at half-time, and it was looking like Tipperary were going to be back on top. If you remember, Limerick were bidding for 3 Munster titles in a row. They had beaten Tipperary 2 seasons previous in the Munster final in 2019, and Tipperary and Liam Sheedy's men were very much gunning for revenge, and at half-time it looked very much like that. Limerick were flat and poor, and they just struggled to find any momentum in the game, but the second half performance by Limerick was honestly one of the best performances I've ever seen, because to trail by 10 points in a Munster final when the pressure is on, when it's not looking good, and to turn it around in the way that they did in the third quarter was absolutely sensational. Limerick outscored Tipperary by a goal and 10 points to 1 point in the third quarter, with a goal from Shamie Flanagan and some fine points from Grode Hegarty and Tom Morrissey. Cathal Hayes then produced one of the best goals ever seen in a Munster final as Limerick began to run away with it. And I think that was the most impressive thing about this comeback, was that Limerick, this game was almost over with actually about 5 to 10 minutes to go, and it was mental because Limerick were trailing by 10 points at half time. But it wasn't just a comeback, it was an absolute domination, an absolute hammering in the second half. And Limerick just took the game by the scruff of the neck and completely turned it inside and out. And it was an absolute dominant performance from the Treaty County, and I think for Limerick fans it's one that lives long in the memory. For Tipperary fans it's certainly one that you won't want to remember anytime soon, put it that way. In at number 7 we have our first football comeback on this list, and it was Westmeath versus Meath in the 2015 Leinster Senior Football Championship semi-final. Westmeath had surprisingly never beaten Meath in the championship coming into this one, and having trailed by 8 points at half time, it looked like the Lake County would have to wait for another year to shoot their shot against the Royals. However, second half goals from Kieran Martin and John Heslin saw Westmeath do the unthinkable as they outscored the Royals 2 goals and 8 points to a point on an unforgettable day for Westmeath fans. And certainly when you speak to Westmeath fans and you ask them what was their most memorable moment, a lot of them would actually say that this was one of the probably the most memorable moment that they've ever had in Croke Park. I mean, don't get me wrong, the 2004 Leinster final and winning that championship was huge for Westmeath, but considering where Westmeath football was in the build up to this game, come back from the dead in the way that they did and also get their first championship win against their big rivals in Meath, it was an extraordinary result, and certainly one that lives long in the memory. To come from 8 points down at half time, a remarkable turnaround from Westmeath, and certainly one that lives long in the memory for the Lake County. In at 6, it's another comeback that involves Meath, and this time it was Wexford who completed the comeback. And certainly for Meath fans, you won't want to see this one either, because this happened in the 2008 Leinster Senior Football Championship, and when half-time blew in this one, you wouldn't have begrudged any Wexford fans for leaving at half-time with their side 10 points down and this looking like it was only going to go one way. And I remember actually watching this game as a kid, or keeping an eye on it, and you were thinking, Jesus, what on earth is going on with Wexford? I think they kicked like 1 or 2 points in the first half. And don't get me wrong, like Wexford are actually a pretty good team back then. They actually went on to reach the All-Ireland semi-final in this same season, and they were a very good side. And they had the likes of Matty Ford in their ranks. They had the likes of Redmond Barry and PJ Banville. They were a very, very good team, and it was quite surprising seeing them getting beat as comfortably as they were at halftime by Meath. That wasn't to take anything away from Meath. Meath were a very good side back then as well, but you certainly didn't expect this to be as big of a landslide as it was at halftime. However, Wexford did kick into gear. A 52nd minute goal by Redmond Barry and another followed from PJ Banville. It all happened on the hour mark, which gave the Yellow Bellies a sense of hope. Shane Roach would kick the leveller before Matty Ford popped over the winner in injury time to seal a famous win for Wexford. A remarkable turnaround, a famous win versus Meath. 10 points down at half time. This one looked good and done. It looked done and dusted. Meath were already preparing for the next round of the Leinster Championship, but Wexford had other ideas. An extraordinary turnaround, and certainly one that lives long in the memory of Wexford fans. In at number 5, we have Mayo versus Dublin in the 2006 All-Ireland semi-final. A game that's mostly known for the Hillgate saga and everything that went with it. And I think when a lot of people look back at this game, they talk about how Mayo, obviously training in front of the hill, very much disrupted the Dublin team, and sort of the animosity that followed and all the chaos that followed very much after that. And funny enough, this was actually my first game on Hill 16, would you believe? The atmosphere was honestly incredible, and I think the fact that Mayo obviously trained in front of the hill, sort of rose the atmosphere up. But I think one thing is important that a lot of people actually forget about the game is that Dublin did actually lead for the majority of the game, and going into the final quarter, they led by 7 points, and this looked like Dublin were going to book themselves into their first All-Ireland final since 1995. Mayo hadn't beaten Dublin in the championship coming into this game. This hadn't been the rivalry that we know of Dublin and Mayo today, and this was sort of one of the very early stages of the Dublin and Mayo rivalry. Mayo came roaring back, just as Mayo do, in classic vintage Mayo fashion. A young Andy Moran came off the bench to silence the hill with a brilliant goal before Kieran MacDonald, who played an absolute blinder that day from a Mayo perspective, he eventually kicked the winner, sending the men in green and red to the All-Ireland final. A remarkable turnaround from a Mayo perspective, as they very much silenced the hill and silenced the Dublin fans in Croke Park. And certainly as a Dublin fan, it was painful coming out of that game, and certainly for me, it remains one of the most painful defeats I've had as a Dublin fan, just because you're 7 points up, and I think for fans, when you've been there, you're already mentally thinking towards the final. You're already mentally thinking towards, will I get a ticket for the final? We're there. I think we're there, and you get that sense of hope, and it's the hope that kills you. And Mayo, and to be fair, for Mayo fans, they would have been looking at that game at the time thinking, this looks gone, this looks done, and then they came roaring back from the dead, and there probably is nothing sweeter than it, in fairness. And a remarkable day for Mayo GAA. And we talked before about that game in terms of how when your team is leading and looking good, and then your team throws a lead away, you feel that pain and you feel that misery. And when you speak to Mayo supporters, they will look at this game, Kerry versus Mayo in the 2014 All-Ireland Senior Football Championship semi-final replay, as one of probably the most painful moments for Mayo fans, because a game that's mostly remembered for it bizarrely taking place in the Gaelic grounds and Mayo Mick turning into the Incredible Hulk on the sidelines. It's easy to forget that Kerry came roaring back from the dead on a day where Mayo looked to seal another All-Ireland final appearance. Kieran Donaghy rolled back the years as Kerry came from 7 down to eventually win out in extra time by 3 points. And I think for Mayo supporters, from speaking to Mayo fans down the years on the podcast and everything else, don't get me wrong, for a lot of Mayo fans, it was painful enough having lost in a lot of those finals to Dublin and, the final in 2021 to Tyrone and other games down the years. But a lot of Mayo fans look at this one as probably one of the most painful, because if you remember, Dublin had lost to Donegal, and don't get me wrong, would Mayo have beaten Donegal in the 2014 All-Ireland final? I don't know. I think Donegal probably would have been slight favourites given they beat Mayo in the final 2 seasons previous, and they'd obviously just beaten Dublin in the semi-finals. But Mayo were there. They had this game done and dusted going into the closing minutes, and they just completely lost the run of themselves. There was definitely a lot of contentious decisions that day by the referee, hence why Mayo Mick decided he had enough and decided he was just going to beat up the referee, which is still hilarious. I mean, don't get me wrong, you know, I'm all for protection of referees and everything else, but like, it was just mad seeing a fan, and it was like, remember the amount of people that were around him? It was like 6 people around him, and like, the poor girl who was with him, that was like his daughter or something like that. Absolutely mental stuff. Apparently he still goes to a lot of the games and he's still allowed into the games, which to be fair is good to see. I think at the end of the day, if you have, you know, I think everyone deserves second chances, and obviously Mayo Mick just completely, he lost the head. And look, to be fair, there was a lot of bad decisions that day, and you can understand why he went mad. But yeah, I remember watching it at the time and you were like, what on earth is going on here? And it was just... But Kerry did go on to win the game, and they did go on to win the All-Ireland as well, and I think that was a painful one for Mayo, just because, especially with the game in the Gaelic grounds as well, it's just one of those definitive games that has bad memories for Mayo fans, and as bad as some of the other All-Ireland finals was, like, to be fair, you know, 2017, 2016, you were losing to one of the greatest teams of a generation. In 2014, Kerry, don't get me wrong, were deserved All-Ireland winners, but they were nowhere near the levels of Dublin, and I think Mayo more than had that in them to win that game, and they let it slip. Kerry won the game and went on to win the All-Ireland. In at number 3, it's our first feature of a ladies football match in on this list, and it was Dublin against Cork in the 2014 ladies football final. The Dubs looked more than on track for a first ever All-Ireland ladies football championship, sailing into a 10-point lead at the start of the second half in the final. However, the Rebelettes picked away at Dublin's lead until Emer Scally netted a vital goal that saw them incredibly level the game going into injury time. Geraldine O'Flynn then kicked the winner to break Dublin hearts and seal the 4 in a row for Cork. This was another painful one as well. Dublin had been really trying to break their duck in the All-Ireland Ladies Football Championship and hadn't had any luck up until this point. And Cork looked down and out. It looked like Dublin had their number. Dublin were flying out of traps, playing some brilliant and wonderful football in the first half, and it looked like this was going to be Dublin's year and Dublin's moment to win the Ladies Football Championship. But Cork had other ideas. They came roaring back into the game. Geraldine O'Flynn was sensational. Emer Scally had a very good game as well, and unfortunately from a Dublin perspective, Cork produced one of the all-time comebacks. The greatest comeback in ladies football, absolutely no doubts about it. And Cork completed what was a memorable day for their supporters, and unfortunately for Dublin, it was a very disappointing day, make no question about it. In at number 2, it was Offaly against Kerry in the 1982 All-Ireland Senior Football Championship final. Kerry fans, look away now, because this is definitely one that brings up a lot of pain and a lot of trauma and everything else. Going into the final 5 minutes, the Kingdom's name was practically on the trophy. 5 points up in the final 5 minutes to complete a historic 5 in a row. What could go wrong? Well, Matt Connor scored 2 quick 4 points before Seamus Darby scored one of the most famous and iconic goals in the history of the GAA to seal a historic All-Ireland win for Offaly. As you'll remember, Kerry bidding for 5 in a row. They were bidding to become the first team, the first men's team, and the first team across all codes of the GAA to win 5 All-Ireland titles in a row, and it looked like it was going to happen. Kerry were the dominant force back then. They were by far the best team in the country, but Offaly had other ideas. They stuck in the game, kicked a couple of late points, and then they obviously get that goal from Seamus Darby as well. And look, in terms of the comeback, this wasn't as big of a comeback as some of the others on this list. I mean, we were talking about 10, 12 point leads, but this comeback was so impressive because for me it was against probably one of the greatest GAA teams of all time in Kerry. Offaly weren't the dominant force by any stretch of the imagination in terms of the All-Ireland scene, and they were 5 points down going into the final 5 minutes. Like, that's a big lead in my opinion against such a great team in Kerry. And the fact that Offaly were able to turn that around and win the game is nothing short of remarkable in my opinion. And that's why this is number 2, because they did it in an All-Ireland final. They did it to win their county an All-Ireland championship, and it's a historic moment. It definitely goes down as one of the greatest GAA moments of all time. And what a day it was for Offaly. And thank God, by the way, as a Dublin fan, because you know, we went on to win the 5 in a row most recently. In case you didn't hear, you probably didn't. Maybe you did. But in fairness, Kerry have certainly had their days, and they'll continue to have their days and everything else, make no question about it. But what a day it was for Offaly, and certainly a heartbreaking one for the men from the Kingdom. Before we move into number 1, we will run through some honourable mentions. So Meath versus Cork in the Ladies Football Championship semi-final in 2021. You remember that late comeback from Meath to turn it around. That was certainly a remarkable story from a Meath perspective. Limerick versus Kilkenny this year in 2023. They were 5 points down at the early parts of the second half and came back to win the game in flying fashion, scoring 21 points in the second half and 16 points on from that moment where Kilkenny were 5 points in front. Tipperary versus Cork in 1991 was an extraordinary turnaround from a Tipperary perspective. They were 9 points down with 50 minutes on the clock, but won out by 4 points. Limerick versus Tipperary in 1996 was also a very poignant comeback from a Limerick perspective. Limerick came from 10 points down in the Munster final to force a replay. And Limerick versus Waterford in 2001, this was definitely the closest to getting on this list. Limerick trailed Waterford by 11 points after 20 minutes. The scoreline was actually 2 goals and 6 points to Waterford to 1 point to Limerick. But Limerick, as they do, as we've seen with a lot of the comebacks on this list, they came roaring back to win by 3 points, and it was an extraordinary turnaround from a Limerick perspective. Kilkenny's comeback against Galway in 1997 was very memorable as well, and Waterford's comeback against Cork in 2004 certainly lives long in the memory, and that was obviously the famous game where John Milan gave his very infamous post-match speech. But yeah, certainly some other comebacks that maybe I haven't mentioned, but do let me know in the comments down below. But anyway, let's get into number 1, and this was certainly another very famous comeback. And so we move on to number 1 on this list, and it was Offaly versus Limerick in 1994. Just 12 years after the footballers produced one of the most iconic comebacks in the history of the GAA. This time it was the hurlers, an iconic comeback against Limerick in the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship final in 1994. The game known as the 5-minute final saw Limerick dominate throughout and lead by 5 going into the final 5 minutes. However, the faithful had other ideas and scored 2 dramatic late goals from Patrick Connors and Johnny Dooley to bring the Liam McCarthy back to the Midlands. And this was an extraordinary game. I mean, Limerick it was done and dusted. Like, the game was over. It was looking like Limerick were going to be taking the Liam McCarthy back for the first time in 21 years. Their last All-Ireland title was in 1973. But Offaly sealed a monumentous comeback, an incredible turnaround, those 2 late goals. And it lives long in the memory for Offaly fans. And again, like, to do that in an All-Ireland final, when your team looks down and out, when it looks like Limerick are going to get over the line, just a remarkable comeback. And it's definitely one of the most famous moments in the history of the GAA, and certainly one of the most famous comebacks from an Offaly perspective. And Offaly, as we've seen, have certainly been involved in their fair share of comebacks down the years. And yeah, what it must be like to be an Offaly fan, to see your side in 1982 in the football final look down and out, looking beaten, and then come back and win it. And then in the final against Limerick, the exact same. And for Limerick fans, it's definitely one of the most painful moments being a Limerick fan, I'd imagine, having seen them obviously lose that final. But it's fair to say Limerick fans nowadays don't very rarely suffer any heartbreak, and if anything, Limerick are usually the side to dish out heartbreak to others and come back from the dead against other teams. But this was a remarkable day for Offaly GAA. So that's the top 10 GAA comebacks. Let me know if you agree, disagree in the comments down below. Let me know what was your biggest GAA comeback or best GAA comeback, and let me know what you thought of this video. Leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, very much appreciated. Closing in on 4,500 subscribers, so if we could get there as soon as possible, that would be absolutely fantastic. And do appreciate all the comments and everything else, and if you could hit that subscribe button, it very much helps the channel grow. If you could hit the like button as well, that'd be absolutely brilliant. And yeah, until the next video, I'll speak to you soon.